I'm moved by this because it is not the first time that the issues of academic freedom have cropped up in the context of a critique of settler colonization, racism, and violence toward encapsulated communities. It came up in the context of South Africa, and I was part of that movement as well. I want to particularly thank Jewish Voice for Peace, which is the organization that I belong to. Yes, I look like an Irish Catholic. That's half my family. The brain, that's the other half. That's the maternal half. So, but all of them were fiercely anti-institutional religion. Okay? Both the Catholics and the Jews in my family. So that's where I'm coming from. You have to understand that. I have friends in Israel who are on the left. I have friends in the West Bank who are on the left. So they are not sympathizers with the right wing of anything. And they're caught. And who better to be able to weigh the academic freedom issues than people from that area and people who come from other contexts of settler colonization and genocide. And our country comes dripping in blood from those factors, and it is our need and our obligation, being from this country, which is such a supporter of a religious state when we don't support other religious states, that we actually weigh in on what would work, what might be a step past historical suffering to contemporary social justice. This is our obligation. We can be ignored, it's fine, but we need to weigh in. We need to weigh in for our sake, as well as the sakes of the people who are more immediately implicated. And to that end, with a very fine record of looking at human rights issues and changing notions of what constitutes citizenship and human rights, I want to introduce Lisa Rofel. She is professor of anthropology from UC Santa Cruz, and she is one of the people who, in our professional organization, along with myself and our colleagues in anthropology, will be weighing and deciding on a motion before the association in November to boycott, cultural boycott of institutions in Israel. And it will be a fierce fight, and we will be there. And it is not easy. Our friends are on both sides. But there it is. It is. And it has to be done without rancor, because you can't persuade someone when all they hear is your anger. There's a lot to be angry about. But Lisa Rofel has unpacked this. She has a specialization in feminist anthropology, in gender and sexuality, in urban political economy and culture, the popular cultural manifestations of imperial capitalism and transnational capitalism. And her field area is China, but like all of us anthropologists, we are promiscuous. So with that wonderful introduction, I hope, although we're getting a little long on the tooth for that. But so with that said, I introduce you to Lisa Rofel.
Thank you, Christine, for a very generous introduction that I don't think I really deserve. And I can't thank David enough for putting together this conference. I'm just so grateful to have this opportunity to meet a lot of people in person who I've been emailing for years, and I won't mention who, but I get people's genders wrong, and I'm not really big on the internet, so I don't look up people's photos, and I'm so happy to meet all of you in person. I also want to thank Lubna for being incredibly well organized in getting us all here in a timely manner. Okay, so I'm just going to read my talk, which is, I thought the title was too out there, but David said I should keep it. So the title of my talk is A So-Called Self-Hating Anti-Semitic Jew Speaks Out. When I was an undergraduate, we were still in the midst of the Cold War. Any discussion by a faculty member of Marxism or communism could lead to the denial of tenure. Lecturers, rarer then, were terminated. Graduate students did not want to jeopardize their careers. Sound familiar? As students, we felt that our Marxist study groups were illicit. The free speech movement had already taken place, yet the limit case for academic freedom then was a Marxist critique of capitalism. Today, the Cold War is over. Generally speaking, we have no trouble within the academy offering a critique of capitalism. That is not to say it's a simple matter or that critique is sufficient. And faculty who talk about capitalism as an exploitative system certainly find it more difficult to gain the power and voice of a public intellectual who will be feted by mainstream media. But the limit case of academic freedom in the United States today is a discussion of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Or to be more precise, the limit case emerges when one voices criticism of Israel for its occupation and clear support for Palestinian rights. Speaking out on this issue in particular involves real risks and real harassment. It can lead to losing one's job, sometimes even if one is tenured, to being fired or not rehired or not hired at all. We can think of the case of Norman Finkelstein, who was fired from his academic job, the harassment of Professor Nadia Abul-Haj when she was coming up for tenure at Columbia, and the particularly egregious case of Professor Sami Al-Arian that still sticks in my throat, a Palestinian American and a longtime tenured computer engineering professor at the University of Florida, who was active in bringing attention to the situation of Palestinians. Right after 9/11, the right-wing radio pundit O'Reilly smeared him for supposedly calling for the death of Israel and for giving charity funding to Palestinian organizations. He was summarily fired from the university and thrown into jail, charged with supporting a Palestinian group on the State Department's terrorist list. In fact, he was kept in solitary confinement for over a year and then finally pled guilty in 2006 to a plea bargain to helping a so-called specially designated terrorist organization. In 2006, he refused to testify before a federal grand jury that was on a witch hunt for so-called terrorists, and they threw him into jail again for contempt of court. In 2007 and 2008, he was again called to testify before a grand jury, and he again refused and again was thrown into jail. The only way he finally managed to crawl out of this hellhole was to agree to be deported to Turkey and to give up his U.S. permanent resident status. Professor Al-Arian's case will live in infamy alongside the deportation of Russian Jewish communists in the 1920s. Obviously, those who want to suppress criticism of Israel go to great lengths. Their ongoing efforts to suppress academic freedom when it pertains to criticism of Israel have led to having programs defunded, as we are witnessing with Middle East Studies programs. It has led to students being put on a list posted on the internet in an effort to derail their future careers, as we witnessed last year right here at UC Riverside. Criticizing Israel for its occupation can lead to constant harassment, having one's emails demanded under the California Public Documents Act, being the recipient of a hate mail campaign, being brought up on charges at one's university, being subject to investigation about one's teaching, having one's campus brought up on charges of supposedly fostering an anti-Semitic climate if they support faculty's academic freedom to speak out on this matter. These tactics remind us forcefully of the McCarthy era. Also worrisome are recent civility codes being discussed and instituted at universities across the country in light of Professor Steven Salaita's firing. These civility codes are essentially restrictions on academic freedom. They are based on the spurious idea that education should always be a comfortable experience and that no one should ever have their views challenged. The project of producing civil subjects has an eerie resonance with the British Empire's use of the concept of civilization and the dichotomy of civilized uncivilized to justify its rule. We can examine the civility codes or cause for civility as a current biopolitical technology of rule that is linked to neoliberal imperial projects. They link the production of with regulation, the production of a commodified and privatized university, the production of commodified knowledge, and the regulation of this hegemonic order. These calls for civility are not just about speech, but about a whole array of affects and behaviors. Indeed, Professor Salaita was most attacked for being angry and sarcastic. It is unseemly to be angry, let alone question those neoliberal imperial projects that emanate from the United States. A subject who acts civilly might express disagreement in a liberal manner, that is, in such a way that it really does not matter what the ultimate outcome of the debate is. Everyone goes home to be snug in their beds, not having shaken at all the order of things. If we are going to have public universities become entirely reliant on capital investments and donor funds, if we are going to admit only students who can afford the tuition at public universities, thus returning to the original concept of the university as a place for elites only, in other words, if we are going to fully privatize public universities, then we certainly do not want unseemly behavior, uncivil affects that might create anxiety in parents, donors, and investors about the fact that students might learn that questioning and challenging often produces discomfort and knowledge that goes against their former ideas. Yet beyond the issue of donors and funding, civil subjects, dare I say civilized subjects, as in subject to a regime of civilizing, signifies, as with British imperial rule, how civilizing missions, free trade regimes which the U.S. has tried to dominate, and imperial projects articulate with one another. Thus it should come as no surprise that various boards of trustees are demanding greater oversight of universities. These are all the more reason for everyone to speak out in support of those who have taken risks to condemn the humanitarian disaster that is the Israeli occupation today. Thus far, I have not heard of anyone experiencing these risks and harassments when they speak out in support of the Israeli occupation or in support of whatever the Israeli government does. Criticizing Israel can lead to accusations of anti-Semitism or accusations of being a self-hating Jew. I first learned that I am a so-called self-hating Jew in 2008. The previous year, I had organized 2 events on my campus. One was a symposium called Alternative Histories Within and Beyond Zionism. David Theo Goldberg and Judith Butler spoke, among others. They spoke about the racism that has been produced out of Zionism, both against Palestinians and among Jews in Israel, with the dominant Ashkenazi group discriminating against Mizrahi Jews. The second event was a speaker from the group of Israeli soldiers who are against the occupation. That group is called Breaking the Silence. As a result of these events, I was put on a list posted on the internet called Self-Hating Jews. There were about 2,000 of us. Judith Butler quipped that they had made it easier for us to find one another. Eventually, those at the forefront of this campaign decided this tactic was not, let us say, strategic. So they dropped it and went on to their current charges of anti-Semitism, which they find has more cachet. Before I get into the anti-Semitism charges, I should say that the 2 people on our campus who were incensed by the events I organized decided to bring me up on charges of having broken the rules of academic freedom by bringing political speech onto campus and by having supposedly unbalanced events. 3 times. They brought me up on charges 3 times. None of their complaints held up. They also orchestrated an email campaign. I received about 1,000 hate emails from people who did not attend the event from all over the world, comparing me to the Nazis and accusing me of helping another Holocaust to take place. They were also sent to my chancellor and all the departments and units on campus that had co-sponsored the events I organized. At least it made people aware that I was not exaggerating. Most of the letters were written with the exact same wording, which they had undoubtedly taken from the international call to do so. To quote just a few of them, quote, I was deeply disturbed by a state-funded institution, an institution of higher learning, presenting a conference that was biased, politically motivated, and factually incorrect, end quote. Quote, Among the recommendations in the letter, were, quote, re-examine and reinforce guidelines for academic and intellectual standards, for distinguishing facts from unsubstantiated allegation, and for distinguishing political advocacy from legitimate educational programs. Develop mandatory sensitivity training programs for faculty and students about anti-Semitism and its recent variant, anti-Zionism, end quote. Quote, one person relabeled the conference, calling it the Anti-Israel Conference. This person went on to say that the conference was one-sided and anti-Israel. Quote, while the administration will tell us that they are not obligated to present all perspectives at every conference, it seems that they simply never find the time to present a mainstream Israeli perspective, end quote. So at this time, which was in 2007, those who were trying to suppress criticism of Israel and the Israeli occupation had already landed on what they thought would be a successful strategy of using the accusation of anti-Semitism to pursue this agenda. Kenneth Marcus, who had previously headed the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, which handles complaints of discrimination based on race and ethnicity, was pioneering this lawfare tactic at this time. When he was at the helm, charges of anti-Semitism were brought against 3 University of California campuses, UC Santa Cruz, my campus, UC Irvine, and UC Berkeley. The charges listed the activities I had organized as part of their main evidence of anti-Semitism on my campus. They conveniently neglected to mention that everyone who had participated in these events was Jewish. Those who want to suppress criticism of the Israeli occupation have also managed to get the California legislature to adopt a resolution condemning anti-Semitism on California university campuses. Most irksome about this resolution are 3 things. The fact that many of the politicians had not even read the resolution when they voted on it, presumably because they have to spend too much time on fundraising instead of a full discussion of academic freedom. Secondly, that voting to condemn anti-Semitism has become one of those knee-jerk, feel-good moves that is nearly meaningless and therefore holds the danger of making true anti-Semitism difficult to discern. And 3, that the students who face the overwhelming amount of harassment today are those students protesting the Israeli occupation, along with those students who face Islamophobia, of which we will hear more from both Palestine Legal and Jewish Voice for Peace. Recently, there is pressure on the University of California, which is considering a redefinition of their policy on tolerance, to highlight anti-Semitism, which some have tried to claim is rampant on the University of California campuses. The pressure is to adopt the State Department definition of anti-Semitism. The State Department used the definition of anti-Semitism by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, which Europe subsequently dropped. It begins with a general definition, quote, a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community and institutions and religious facilities. End quote. The State Department website then lists examples of anti-Semitism. 1, calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews, often in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. 2, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as a collective, especially but not exclusively the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. 3, accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, the State of Israel, or even for acts committed by non-Jews. Accusing the Jews as a 5, accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, and finally, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. But then the State Department website goes on to elaborate anti-Semitism relative to Israel. Okay, quote, examples of the ways in which anti-Semitism manifests itself with regard to the State of Israel, taking into account the overall context, could include 1, demonizing Israel, which would be using symbols and images associated with anti-Semitism to characterize Israel, or drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to the Nazis, or blaming Israel for all interreligious or political tensions. using a double standard for Israel, applying double standards by requiring it to have behaviors not expected of any other, and they use the word, democratic nation. Multilateral organizations focusing on Israel only for human rights investigations. And then finally, delegitimizing Israel, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, and denying Israel the right to exist. Okay, end quote. Ironically, although one of the charges listed is the spurious idea that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to their own nation, in this State Department definition, Israel is treated as an essential attribute of Jewish identity, an equation which I categorically reject. In April 2012, then interim president of Cal State Northridge, Professor Harold Hellenbrand, stated it quite eloquently in a letter he issued defending Professor David Klein for posting his criticisms of Israel on his website. Quote from Hellenbrand, "These critics implicitly fuse the elected policy of the Israeli government with God's covenant with the Jews as a spiritual people and/or ethnic tribe. This consolidation empowers them to denounce with the fury of Jeremiah dissent to policy, as if it were apostasy," end quote. Now, the State Department does have a caveat at the end of their list equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. The caveat states, quote, "However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic," end quote. This caveat, though stuck at the end of the State Department statement, is in fact at the heart of the matter. Is criticism of Israel anti-Semitic prima facie just because it criticizes Israel? Or can we distinguish between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism? The State Department obviously finds itself stuck in its own contradictions about the relationship between criticism of a nation state and racism. Let me emphasize that I believe anti-Semitism exists in the world, especially in Christian Europe. I take anti-Semitism to be the expression of revulsion for the inherent and universal nature of an ethnic group centered on a creed. So we do see targeting of Jewish synagogues and cemeteries and shops. Even if we want to say this is anger about the Israeli occupation, this is an anti-Semitic way of expressing that anger by not only holding all Jews collectively responsible for the Israeli occupation, but also doing so through violence. But anti-Semitism exists not only in Christian Europe. The summer before last, I was perusing a bookstore in Beijing. I was doing research in Beijing, so I just go to the bookstores usually, and I came across a book in Chinese extolling Israel. As some of you may know, China has been developing close ties with Israel, though it has never formally repudiated its political support for Palestinian rights. These ties are especially close through the sale of military weapons, Israel selling weapons to China. The book extolling Israel was urging Chinese to imitate Israel's success and claimed that the root of that success was Jews' special ability to make money. Despite this kind of anti-Semitism, let me also say that I'm angry with the state of Israel for committing horrendous acts in my name as a Jew, and for acting as if they represent the interests and needs of Jews all over the world, let alone in their own country. And I am sick and tired of the charge of anti-Semitism blurring what I consider to be true anti-Semitism from criticism of Israel. The State Department definition opens the door to blurring that boundary. Rather than acknowledging the humanitarian disaster that the Israeli state has created in Palestine, rather than acknowledging that Israel is a settler colonial state, rather than acknowledging that the Israeli government has applied some of the same tactics to Palestinians that they experienced in Christian Europe, the State Department pretends there is an equivalence between Jews and Palestinians, and thus states that we should not blame Israel for all the political tensions. Leaving aside for the moment the statement that Israel is a democratic nation, when in fact it is democratic for Jews only, the State Department also inverts the fact that Israel is one of the only nations we do not hold to account for its consistent violation of international law. Not only are we told we cannot hold it to account, we are not even supposed to voice criticism of Israel for its horrendous human rights violations. Hence the use of the charge of anti-Semitism to try to silence that criticism. I am sick and tired of this opportunistic use of the charge of anti-Semitism precisely because I believe that anti-Semitism does still exist, and yet this opportunistic use of this charge makes it extremely difficult to discuss those cases as distinct from criticism of the Israeli occupation. I am sick and tired of the opportunistic use of this charge because so many of us speak out as Jews who believe that Judaism should stand for social justice. And I believe strongly that Jews should stand up and say, "Not in my name." I grew up with a great deal of anti-Semitism. I was raised as an Orthodox religious Jew who fervently and without question supported Israel. Not just its right to exist, but everything the Israeli state did. I grew up in the 50s and 60s in a modern Orthodox community in the small city of Wilmington, Delaware. Everyone in our community, our Jewish community, was of Russian, Eastern European, or German descent. Except for the time we spent in public school, our entire lives revolved around Judaism. Hebrew school 3 times a week, services on Friday nights and Saturdays, and numerous Jewish holidays, which always led us out of public school. Our social lives were completely within the Jewish community. We all supported Israel fervently. We had Holocaust survivors in our midst. Our parents had grown up in that shadow. Although my particular synagogue was composed mainly of working class and petty bourgeois small shop owners, people gave generously to Israel. We sang the Israeli national anthem after the Friday evening service. Our parents formed a song and dance troupe that performed Israeli numbers. They wore, of course, the light blue and white colors of Israel. It was in the small details as well as the larger ideology that our lives became so intertwined with Israel that even though many of us had never been there and we actually only had the vaguest idea of the actual situation in Palestine, we were taught to feel as if we were a people with essentially 2 nationalities. There was no question and no questioning about the necessity of the state of Israel. The major employer in our town at that time was the DuPont Company, who first gained its wealth through military weapons in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then moved to chemicals, including chemical weapons. When I was young, they refused to hire Jews. We lived in segregated neighborhoods in Wilmington. Jews, Catholics, WASPs, and African Americans lived in separate areas of town. The boundaries were clear and nameable. Our working class Jewish neighborhood in the heart of town was contiguous with African American neighborhoods. Public school integration occurred as I was going through elementary school. Jews were not allowed to move into the WASP areas of town, though we could certainly move down the racial hierarchy into African American and Catholic neighborhoods. I often had pennies thrown at my feet to see if, as a Jew, I would pick them up. To this day, I cannot pick up a penny if I see it on the sidewalk. My sister and I were part of the first small group of Jews allowed to attend a local private school. We were scholarship students. Every morning, a teacher read to the school body from the Christian Bible. We were not allowed to attend our classmates' parties as they held them in country clubs that did not admit Jews. This anti-Semitism was real, it was institutionalized, and it was also part of my classmates' everyday sensibilities. On the other hand, in this same period, there were institutionalized programs to help Jews advance socially and economically, including the infamous federal housing program to help with mortgages that redlined African American communities at the same time. This was the period when Jews famously became white, as documented by anthropologist Karen Sachs. And part of becoming white, as Aviva Chomsky has argued, is embracing the racism towards others in the American racial hierarchy. But this anti-Semitism is a far, far cry from the criticism that Israel is an occupier state, that the Israeli state systematically denies Palestinians their civil and human rights, that the Israeli state commits regular violence against Palestinians, that Israel is trying to push all Palestinians off the land of Palestine, and towards that end is engaged in ethnic cleansing. We must all hold on to a very clear and real distinction. Otherwise, the memory of the Holocaust will have been for naught. It was not easy for me to wrench myself away from the unquestioning support of Israel I had learned in my youth. It was a wrenching experience, for it's not like deciding to vote Democrat instead of Republican. It's more like pulling the insides out of yourself and reworking your entire sense of who you are. It was a slow, painful process. It began for me with Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. I'm embarrassed it took that long. And its unspeakable support for the massacres of Palestinian refugees in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in southern Lebanon. I could think of no justification whatsoever for either the invasion or the massacres. I then had the good fortune to meet a Jewish Israeli feminist leftist, Madar Lavi, who began to teach me what was actually going on in Israel, Palestine. From there, I met other Israeli leftists who continued my education. Then the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network held a year-long seminar on the history of Zionism. I benefited enormously from those readings. My education in anthropology, post-colonial feminism, and critical race and cultural studies, along with my own anti-imperialist politics, further contributed to my eventual understanding that the problem with Zionism shared in other parts of the world is ethno nationalism, the belief that to create a space for being Jewish in the world, or for creating any kind of social community, is to establish constricted national boundaries that are based on narrow political, cultural, and social exclusions. I cannot emphasize enough that Israel is no exception. The invocation of exceptionalism is precisely how ethno-nationalism gains its power. I should say that still, recently, I have indeed encountered anti-Semitism with regard to the Palestine-Israel conflict. A colleague of mine at UC Santa Cruz, someone whom I view as a progressive activist intellectual on my campus, told me that the issue of the Israeli occupation is a matter for you Jews to figure out among yourselves. I cannot imagine a similar comment being made to African Americans about apartheid in South Africa or to Chinese Americans about various abuses in China. In addition to being appalled by this comment, I feel the need to emphasize that nothing could be further from the truth. The U.S. government provides enormous sums of money to Israel every year. Those living in the U.S. are therefore not just witnesses to Israeli crimes, but complicit in them. For that reason, all of us in the United States have a particular responsibility to speak out on this matter. Just last week, I experienced a more inverted form of anti-Semitism. I had invited a well-known South Asian writer to speak on our campus. In our leisurely ride back to San Francisco, I mentioned that I was active in the BDS movement. He was completely in support of Israel and basically accused me of two things. First, romanticizing and identifying with Palestinians, and perhaps, secondly, wanting to convert to Islam. He could conceive of no other way that I could come to my support for BDS except by renouncing my Judaism. In other words, he too has accepted the conflation of a Jewish identity with the policies of the Israeli state. I assured him that I stand very solidly in my Jewish identity and that I had come to these politics out of a strong commitment to social justice, and that, yes, I can't abide by having this horrendous occupation being carried out in my name. But some of you might rightfully call me out for the need to be more precise. I should call these experiences anti-Jewishness or anti-Jewishism. There have been a number of writers who have recently reminded us that the category of Semite includes both Arabs and Jews. If we take seriously this more accurate meaning of Semite, then anti-Semitism includes a number of things. It is the basis for the Israeli occupation and its entire treatment of Palestinians, and is the basis of discrimination against Mizrahi Jews in Israel, which is of a piece with its treatment of Palestinians. But I must also emphasize that anti-Semitism against Jews is at the very heart of the founding of the State of Israel. How convenient for Christian Europe to ship its remaining Jews to another region of the world where hopefully they can be done with them. There are many parallels with the founding of Liberia. Some African Americans dreamed of returning to Africa after the end of slavery. This dream is understandable, but it was also supported by white supremacists who also thought it was a great idea. And the U.S. government lent support to the founding of Liberia. And since that geographical space in Africa had not been the precise homeland of former slaves, it meant displacing those native peoples who had been living there. There were many other African Americans who thought that instead of returning to Africa, they should fight racism in the country they had come to claim as their own, or more exactly, should be able to claim as their own. The current alliance between the Israeli state and US-based Christian evangelicals is equally a pact with anti-Jewishness. The goal of these US Christian evangelicals is to reach the apocalypse. This entails the eventual self-destruction of the state of Israel in order to overcome Judaism in the name of Christianity. It is the height of cynical power-mongering and an abandonment of caring about true anti-Semitism that the Israeli state has allied with them. In a brilliant editorial in the Los Angeles Times last May 2015, Sari Makdisi argued that, quote, in fact, the defenders of Israel on campus are in deep trouble, not because student well-being is at risk, but because the rickety assemblage of distortions and myths used to justify support for Israeli policies cannot withstand scholarly scrutiny. Having lost the actual arguments, Israel's defenders have now declared war on argument itself." End quote. He goes on to elaborate his argument in defense of academic freedom, but I will leave it to his talk tomorrow for us to hear more. What I love about the editorial is both its condemnation of the use of false charges of anti-Semitism to stifle speech, and also its clear sense that by resorting to such tactics, such harassers have shown their own weakness. In other words, those of us who insist on the right to academic freedom to criticize the Israeli occupation are winning the war, or should I say, peace, even if we have to engage in these irritating tactical skirmishes to insist on this right. As I mentioned, most of you probably know that there is now pressure on the University of California to adopt the State Department definition of anti-Semitism in their new policy on tolerance. This move, by the way, is opposed even by one of the people who wrote the State Department definition, as he also recognizes that academic freedom must be preserved. I urge as many of you as possible from Southern California to attend the hearings that will be held by the regents of the University of California on Monday, October 26th on the UCLA campus. In a 1989 article on academic freedom in the Yale Law Journal, Peter Byrne defines academic freedom as the freedom of professors, and I would add students, to reach conclusions that contradict previous dogma, whether within the academy or throughout the larger society. Indeed, he emphasizes that such contradiction is prized as new knowledge, the mark of contribution. Academic speech, he states, can be more free even than the speaker. By that, he means that the speaker may be driven to conclusions by her respect for methodology and evidence that contradict her own preconceptions and cherished assumptions. Moreover, the community of scholars will close ranks behind even the most mediocre scholar, he says, whenever civil authority threatens to punish unorthodox scholarship. Those instances where it has failed to defend its fellows are incidents of permanent shame and regret. And I should say the faculty of the University of Southern Florida did come out in support of Professor Sami Al-Arian. The value of academic speech, Byrne insists, rests on its commitment to truth, however partially understood by the discipline, its honesty and carefulness, its richness of meaning, its doctrinal freedom, and its invitation to criticism. And I would add criticism, but not suppression. Debate, but not silencing. I have been so struck with the refusal of these zealots that they are unwilling to engage in debate with us. Indeed, one of the leading members of the Anti-Defamation League, an organization designed to pursue anti-Semitism, had agreed to engage in a debate on our campus with someone from the ACLU who had been working on defending critics of Israel. Prior to the event, he received a huge amount of pressure from those who take the position of what I call Israel no matter what, not to engage in debate. Why is that? As McDeasy stated, they know that their myths about Israel would not hold up well to scrutiny. Academic freedom, then, in Byrne's view, is both the freedom of professors, and I would add students, from administrative or political interference with research, teaching, and governance, and the constitutional academic freedom that insulates the university in core academic affairs from interference by the state. The courts have repeatedly defended the broadest definitions of academic freedom. First Amendment doctrine recognizes the danger to a democratic political process if officials proscribe some subjects or modes of expression. This sensitivity is heightened by the enormous cultural diversity of the United States polity. Advocates of free expression also properly cast doubt both on the wisdom of officials, even when acting in good faith, to decide which ideas are out of bounds, and on the efficacy of combating apparently dangerous ideas by suppressing them. Finally, many recognize the value to the individual citizen of being the sole legal arbiter of what she shall say, read, or think, because such freedom and responsibility is seen to dignify citizens of a democracy. Returning to Helen Brand, he ends his letter stating, invoking the apparatus of the state to prescribe broad categories of speech in hubs of innovation and disruption like public universities will have the paradoxical effect of chilling public exchange while heating up zealotry. End quote. In this situation, where the tactics to suppress speech about the Israeli occupation resemble McCarthyite anti-communism, Academic freedom is, of course, connected to one's security of employment. Thus, those of us with that security have a special privilege and a special responsibility. Here is where we see the connections between the academy in the US and the situation of Palestine-Israel. Thus, I would like to speak out about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Frankly, I would not have supported the call for BDS when it was first issued by Palestinian civil society groups a decade ago. I had internal work still to do on my relationship to Israel before I could come to this position. But I also think I needed to see more clearly, with eyes wide open, where the Israeli state has been heading, at least since the signing of the Oslo Accords and perhaps from the very beginning: the displacement of the entire Palestinian population off the land of Palestine. The Israeli state will continue to use violent means towards this end of ethnic cleansing. The Israeli state is not interested in Palestinian autonomy or rights, let alone ending the occupation and recognizing the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. Palestinian civil society groups have asked us for solidarity and support of their nonviolent efforts to end this Israeli occupation, to gain equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and to resolve the more than 65-year Palestinian refugee condition. We can and should condemn widespread Israeli violations of Palestinian academic freedom, the ongoing seizure of Palestinian land, destruction of archaeological sites, and systematic and pervasive threats to Palestinian community and culture. We can and should condemn Israeli practices that deny international scholars and students access to research and teaching opportunities in Palestine, both isolating Palestinians and undermining scholarship. And we can and should support a boycott of complicit Israeli institutions as part of the international effort to apply pressure on Israel to end the occupation. Support of the boycott of Israeli academic institutions is an effective way to speak out not only to the Israeli government, but to the US government. It is a crucial way to open up public discourse and to indicate that the US government needs to change its stance. It is about ending the silencing atmosphere in the US Academy about the Palestine-Israel situation. As employees in institutes of higher learning, we have a particular interest in and responsibility to respond to the obstacles to the right to higher education that the Israeli state has created for Palestinians, both inside Israel and in the occupied territories. As educators, we have a responsibility to model forms of horizontal solidarity for our students, showing them that charity is not the only form of engagement that we can have with the world. Ashish Nandi once wrote that, quote, "The present is the historical moment, the permanent yet shifting point of crisis and the time for choice," end quote. I take this present moment as a time for all of us who are working together to end the Israeli occupation, to once again choose social justice, which is the memory of the Shoah that should prevail but has been obscured. I would like to close by emphasizing how great it is to develop this network among those of us who have been actively involved in trying to end the Israeli occupation and to support Palestinian rights. I feel much, much stronger knowing that all of you have my back. I feel able to take risks, knowing that we are all doing this collectively in the name of social justice. I cannot thank David and the other organizers enough for giving us this opportunity. I also want to say that in spite of this ongoing harassment, we have to keep moving forward. Many amazing political accomplishments have happened in my lifetime that I never thought I would see. I look forward to thinking collectively about effective strategies to fight off this harassment on the one hand and fight for Palestinian rights on the other. We have to keep moving forward, and I, for one, take this incredible level of harassment we face as a sign, as does Sari Makdisi, that we are winning. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
So I'm just curious about your feeling about the Jewish right to self-determination, whether you think that there's a legitimate reason for wondering that those exist outside of the West Bank issue.
Well, Can I turn this on? Oh.
Yeah, there it is.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think we can talk about outside of the West Bank issue, Israeli right to exist. I am really, I actually think that that is to be determined about what kind, when you say Israel's right to exist, you mean as a Jewish state, separately as a Jewish state. I personally think Israel has changed the facts on the ground so enormously that I'm not sure there can be two states. Israel has changed that fact on the ground because of their ongoing support for illegal settlements and the expansion of those settlements. So I don't honestly see where there could be a Palestinian state at this point. I'm happy to support whatever Palestinians want to struggle for. But I think Israel is like cutting its feet off by doing this. And so if they keep heading in that direction, I think it's only going to be possible to have a single state. But they're doing that. They're leading to that inexorable situation. So if they want to uproot the settlements, if they want to absolutely forbid them as they are illegal, then I don't see them going in that direction. As I said, I see them going in the opposite direction. So that's one thing. But the second thing is I really have come to despise ethno nationalism. And I really think that we should fight racism wherever it exists. So let's fight anti-Semitism against Jews in Europe as it exists, where it exists. I actually don't like any of the nationalisms I see. That's why I keep saying Israel's not an exception to me. I don't like, sadly, what I see between India and Pakistan. I don't like what we've seen in the former Yugoslavia. I don't like what I see that Turkey is doing to Kurds. I could go on and on with a million. I don't like what China is doing to Tibet and its minorities. I don't like any of these, and Israel is no exception to me in that regard. I don't like any of these ethno-nationalisms, none of them. They have all produced incredible violence. So that is my main concern, how to develop, well, my broadest concern is, yes, how to develop a world where people feel safe, Jews feel safe, Arabs feel safe, Palestinians feel safe. That world we have in small pockets around the world. Yes, I would like to see a world without anti-Jewishness. Yes, I would. If you had asked me 20 years ago, I might have said, yes, Israel is important in that regard. Now, frankly, I feel like if someone asked me where they could go and be safe in the world as a Jew, I would not recommend they go to Israel. If you want to be safe as a Jew, that's not Israel.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm wondering if maybe also we could, in response to this question, think about how historians or people narrate their stories. So one place to start is 67, but another place to start is 1948.
Yes.
And sometimes, I'm just wondering if you could reflect a bit on that in terms of the occupation. For those of us who are also the children of refugees, where when Palestine is defined by the West Bank, that leaves us out of the story.
I completely agree. I read a wonderful book, I taught it last year, by Michel Campos about the end of the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Brothers.
Yeah.
And there's a chapter in there on Zionism I recommend everyone read, because it talks about Jews from Europe coming to talk to Jews who were living in the Ottoman Empire and throughout Palestine, and how they disagreed about what should happen there. In other words, Jews living in this area that was then the Ottoman Empire were certainly welcoming of these Jews from Europe if they wanted to flee the horrible anti-Semitism in Christian Europe. But they were not interested in setting up a separate state just for Jews. And as a result of that political disagreement, the European Ashkenazi Jews marginalized those Arab Jews from the whole political process of setting up the State of Israel, and have continued to marginalize them to this day. So that's a moment, yes, where I feel like, yes, that whole way, and this is why I say ethno-nationalism is the problem, that whole way of setting up a place for Jews, in my view, I wish it had not happened in that way, and I wish that the European Jews had listened to the Arab Jews instead about how they could possibly live in that area, but create a different kind of multinational state, which is what those people were interested in at that time.
Yes.
Lisa, I have a question following up your previous answer, and that is, if you're opposed to ethno nationalism, that leads to a South Africa type solution, where you have a unitary state with no ethnic group having any special privileges. But how do we do this in this case, where most Palestinians and most Israelis don't want a unitary state and are committed to their parallel and separate nationalisms? In other words, how would we create a South Africa solution to Israel and Palestine?
I didn't come expecting to be asked to come up with concrete political solutions. But I'm happy to I guess not happy, but I'm willing to wait in. But I just was planning to talk about academic freedom. But okay, so I mean, I feel like it's not for me to say in a way first of all, I do think what you're implying is probably right. There has to be, let's say, a stage, maybe a period, in which Palestinians have true autonomy and some, political rights. And I don't know if it should include territory. So if there's going to be a separate, I don't know what to call it, space to... So that's why the one-state solution has come up, because I don't think, when you say Palestinians and Israelis, I think Palestinians among themselves have different ideas about what should happen. That's my understanding. But as I said already, Israel has changed the facts on the ground. So I actually think that they have created the ground for a one-state solution with full democratic rights for everybody, and not special rights for Jews, which is the way it is now.
And then you.
This is a wee bit of a comment, but I keep it very brief. I think that the line of questioning that has started, and I'm sure other speakers will take this up in the conference, is very often, and I know this is no one's intention, but sort of asking for these concrete solutions from speakers in Israel-Palestine events tends to be a way in other contexts that these discussions get sidelined away from the question of discussing Palestine, academic freedom, and also solidarity organizing. We're not going to solve the problem of Israel now, and we should keep in mind is how to sort of deal with that sort of question generally on campuses when it often is used as a way to sidetrack from the issues at stake, which is the question of Palestine solidarity.
I'd like to make just a very brief comment also, which is that, one of the things that UCR students can do in our courses so far, is to problematize ethno-nationalism, and especially its masculinism and militarism, and that seeing historical undergirding of all genocidal and ethnic cleansing conditions, being resident in that, gives food for thought. And that's our job as an academic. As a citizen, it may be different, but as an academic, this is what we're supposed to do. And then you had a question over here.
The question that I had was a historical question, and after the last comment, I probably shouldn't ask it. I'm going to do it anyway. It's something that I'm kind of interested in that you brought up about the period of the Ottoman Empire and how the Turks related to the Palestinians during that period, and historically why the Palestinians responded, or the countries surrounding the establishment of when Israel was founded reacted so violently, and the fact that they probably knew that history was not on their side. The question is how the Ottoman Empire viewed the Palestinians during that historical time.
That's a
Yeah.
historical question.
It's an historical question.
All right, forgive me, I was
Okay.
curious.
Basically,
go ahead.
the Ottoman approach to ethnic minorities was the relative autonomy, but definitely pay your taxes. Okay.
I'm an alchemist right here.
Thank you.
And I'm teaching right
Thank
now
you.
a course on a great deal about pluralism and how
Yeah.
our region, unlike Europe, was very receptive. In fact, during Inquisitions, Jews
It was
in
the opener.
Spain and Portugal ended up in the Ottoman Empire. And
Precisely.
the city of Salonika was 50% Jewish. And
Yes.
Istanbul had all the Jews fleeing Europe.
Yes.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
there didn't seem to be any ghettos. I mean, I've written on the history of Istanbul. Yes, they were second-class citizens because they had to pay an extra tax. But the Ottoman Sultan is famous for having said, Europe is stupid to get rid of its Jewish population. We're gaining and they're losing. So that was the attitude as late as the 20th century, World War I. And I'm not saying it was in heaven, but they went through ethno nationalism, which was an ideology imported from Europe, by the way, and colonialism, and that's why they have investigated in the Middle East.
Thank goodness for historians, actually, yes. I would like to thank our speaker, Lisa Rofel, for a fantastic beginning. And I must say that in the struggles against apartheid in South Africa, nobody accused any of us that were pushing for divestment of being self-hating white folks.